3:15 hours, 22nd June 1941. Western Special Military District Headquarters, Minsk. General of the Army, Dmitry Pavlov is standing at the operations table when the first telephone reports come through from the frontier. The messages are clipped, fragmented, delivered by staff officers who are still processing what they are hearing. Artillery fire along the Brest sector. Aircraft reported over Grodno. Forward outposts under bombardment near the Bug River. The reports are arriving in sequence, each one from a different point along the frontier, each one describing the same pattern of fire from the west. Pavlov's standing orders from Moscow are unambiguous. Soviet units along the western frontier are not to respond to provocative incidents without authorization from Stavka. This directive has been in force for weeks. The logic behind it is political. Stalin has received intelligence warnings about German intentions, but has refused to treat them as indicators of imminent war. The directive reflects that calculation. Any uncoordinated Soviet response to a German provocation could be used to justify German escalation. The order stands. Do not provoke. Do not respond without confirmation. At 3:15, the reports from the frontier look, to someone following standing orders, like they could still be a provocation. Cross-border shelling has occurred before. Artillery exchanges along the frontier are not unprecedented. The question Pavlov's staff is trying to answer is scale. Is this one sector or multiple sectors? Is this artillery harassment or something larger? The telephone lines to forward corps are degraded but not yet severed. Information is coming in. The system is processing. The problem is what the information already shows. Multiple sectors, simultaneous impacts. Airfields hit before dawn, 03:22 hours. The report from Brest arrives at the operations table. The fortress is under sustained bombardment, not harassing fire. Sustained bombardment. The volume of artillery required to maintain that kind of fire against a fortified position is not the kind of force assembled for a provocation. It is the kind of force assembled for an assault. At the same moment, forward airfield reports are coming in from Baranovichi and Białystok. Aircraft observed approaching from the west in formation. The reports are incoming. They are not yet confirmed. The staff officers write them onto the map. The picture on the map is already telling the story. The shelling is not concentrated in one location. It is spread across the entire frontage of the Western Special Military District. From Brest in the south to Grodno in the north, the frontier is lit. But the authorization to treat this as war has not arrived from Moscow. The system is waiting. The event is not waiting with it. By 3:30, additional reports confirm air attacks against forward airfields. Soviet aircraft at Baranovichi, Białystok, Kobrin, and other forward bases are on the ground when the Luftwaffe formations arrive. The aircraft are positioned wingtip to wingtip at these fields. This is standard peacetime configuration. It eases maintenance. It reduces the ground area required for servicing. Under peacetime assumptions, it is a rational arrangement. Under the conditions now unfolding in the pre-dawn darkness, it is a catastrophic one. The forward airfields have no hardened shelters. Radar coverage along the western approaches is insufficient to detect mass bomber formations with enough lead time to scramble defensive patrols. The early warning window is too narrow. By the time reports of inbound aircraft reach airfield commanders, the formations are already at range to drop their ordnance. Soviet pilots are scrambling to their aircraft. Some reach cockpits. Some manage to take off. The runway at Baranovichi receives bombs before the second wave of aircraft gets airborne. The runway at Białystok is cratered within the first strike sequence. At Minsk headquarters, 03:45 hours, Pavlov is attempting to reach Moscow. The contact is made. The information is relayed. The directive remains in force. Confirmation is required before the district can respond as though war has begun. This is the first constraint that costs time that cannot be recovered. The question Pavlov's headquarters is asking Moscow is the question that should have been answered before dawn. In its absence, every minute spent seeking authorization is a minute during which German armored columns are staging at the Bug River crossings. Luftwaffe bomb loads are already descending onto parked aircraft, and Soviet forward divisions are absorbing fire they have not been authorized to fully return. 4 o'clock hours. German engineers and assault infantry reach the Bug River crossings. The bridges at Brest and along the Bug are intact. Soviet defensive doctrine called for demolishing frontier bridges in the event of war, but demolition requires authorization, and authorization requires confirmation that war has started, and confirmation has not yet arrived through formal channels. The bridges stand. German assault teams cross them in the pre-dawn dark. Some crossings encounter resistance from border guards and NKVD frontier troops who are already fighting without waiting for orders. These small units hold for minutes or hours. They cannot hold the crossings alone. The armored formations that follow the engineers do not slow down. 4:15 hours. The first reports of German armor across the Bug reach Pavlov's headquarters. Not infantry probing. Armor. Tanks crossing in force on multiple axes. The scale is now undeniable at the staff map level. The district's senior officers are looking at a frontier engagement that spans hundreds of kilometers and involves coordinated air and armored attack in the first operational hour. This is not an incident. This is a campaign opening. Pavlov requests from Moscow the authority to issue full mobilization orders and to authorize his mechanized corps to prepare for offensive response. The request goes up the chain. Time passes. The German timetable does not pause for the Soviet command cycle. 04:30 hours. German Panzer Group 2, commanded by Guderian, is crossing the Bug in strength south of Brest. Panzer Group 3, under Hoth, is driving across the Neman River sector to the north. These are not reconnaissance elements. These are full operational strength armored formations executing the opening strikes of Army Group Center's drive toward Minsk. Soviet border guards and the forward regiments of rifle divisions positioned near the frontier are engaging them. Some of these units fight with considerable tenacity. Individual fortified positions hold for hours under direct tank and artillery fire. The garrison of Brest Fortress, encircled within the first hours of the assault, will resist for weeks. But tactical tenacity at individual points cannot substitute for operational coherence across a front that is already cracking at multiple seams simultaneously. The Soviet division commanders near the border are making decisions without knowing the broader picture. They are fighting their local battles. They do not yet know that armor has crossed at other points. They cannot see the operational geometry that is forming around them. At Pavlov's headquarters, the operational geometry is becoming visible on the map, and what it shows is alarming. 0500 hours. Authorization from Moscow arrives to permit a more active defensive posture. The directive is not a full war order. It is an instruction to resist, to not allow further penetration, and to prepare counterattack options while preserving political space. It is, by 5 o'clock on the morning of June 22, 1941, already behind the pace of events by more than an hour and a half. Soviet aircraft are now attempting to take off from the forward airfields. At Baranovichi, the runway is damaged but partially serviceable. Aircraft that had survived the first strikes are being prepared for sortie. At Białystok, squadrons attempt to form up under continued air attack. The problem is not pilot courage. The problem is that the Luftwaffe has established local air dominance over the forward fields within the first operational period. Every Soviet aircraft that manages to get airborne is flying into a contested environment without radar guidance, without coordinated ground control, and often without knowing where German formations are operating. The aircraft losses in the opening hours are catastrophic. Later assessments will confirm that hundreds of Soviet aircraft are destroyed on the ground across the western military districts during the first day of Barbarossa. The precise numbers vary in historical accounts, but the operational consequence is not disputed. By mid-morning on 22nd June, Soviet air power along the western frontier has been reduced to a fraction of its pre-dawn strength. Without air cover, though every mechanized formation that moves in daylight is visible to German reconnaissance aircraft and vulnerable to Luftwaffe ground attack. This constraint does not appear on the operations map as a single event. It compounds. Every Soviet column ordered to advance is now advancing under air attack. Every movement is tracked. Every concentration of vehicles becomes a target. At 5:30, the staff at Minsk headquarters plots the latest reported positions. German armor is already 20 to 30 kilometers beyond the frontier line in several sectors. In the first 2 hours of the campaign, German formations have covered ground that Soviet planning assumptions expected would absorb contact and slow penetration for at least a day. The timeline is not unfolding according to the estimates in Soviet planning documents. The timeline is compressed. Colonel General Pavlov's headquarters attempts to establish contact with the 4th Army near Brest and the 3rd Army near Grodno. The 4th Army headquarters is under bombardment. Communications are intermittent. The 3rd Army is reporting German armored elements already east of its forward positions. Neither army can provide a coherent picture of its current defensive line because the defensive line has not yet stabilized. The concept of a stable defensive line is already outdated. 6 o'clock hours. German forward elements are pressing beyond the initial border belt. Soviet rifle divisions positioned in the first defensive echelon are engaged along their frontages. Some are holding. Many are falling back under pressure from armor they cannot stop with the anti-tank weapons available to them. The 45mm anti-tank gun that equipped Soviet rifle divisions in 1941 can defeat early German tank variants at close range. But the volume of German armor, the speed of the assault, and the disruption to Soviet command and control means that anti-tank defense cannot be organized coherently. Individual Soviet soldiers and small units are fighting. Battery commanders are expending ammunition at rates not planned for the opening day. Ammunition resupply routes to the forward echelons are already under air attack. At one airfield in the Białystok salient, a Soviet squadron commander organizes surviving aircraft for a reconnaissance sortie over the Bug River crossings. The aircraft that return bring back confirmation of what the headquarters map already shows. German armor is across in force. The columns are deep. They are not slowing down. Was 700 hours. Pavlov orders his mechanized corps to begin preparing for immediate counterattack operations. The mechanized corps assigned to the Western Special Military District represents significant armored strength on paper. The 6th Mechanized Corps, the 11th Mechanized Corps, the 14th Mechanized Corps, and others are to be committed toward the frontier to strike German armored spearheads before they can consolidate. The problem is the state of these formations. Soviet Mechanized Corps in June 1941 are in the middle of a major reorganization. The Red Army had disbanded its large mechanized corps in 1939 and 1940 based on lessons interpreted from the Winter War, then reversed that decision and began rebuilding them. The new corps are not yet complete. Vehicle strengths vary. Many tanks require maintenance, so crew training on newer models is incomplete. The command staffs are working through new organizational procedures. More critically, fuel and ammunition stocks are not fully positioned for immediate offensive operations at full strength. Some units have partial fuel loads. Some units are missing their organic artillery or air defense elements. The corps can move, but they cannot move at full combat capability on 22nd June 1941. 800 hours. The 6th Mechanized Corps under General Katskilevich begins movement toward its assigned counterattack axis. The column moves along road networks northeast of Białystok. German aircraft locate the column within the first hour of movement. Ground attack aircraft strike the column repeatedly. Vehicles burn on the road. Kartskilevich's corps continues moving under attack. It is not destroyed in this first strike, but its vehicles are burning fuel at combat rates. Its maintenance vehicles are falling behind. The march is consuming operational strength before the corps makes contact with German armor. 900 hours. Guderian's Panzer Group 2 is deep enough into Soviet-held territory that forward Soviet headquarters are reporting German armor operating in areas designated as second echelon assembly zones. The German timetable has already overtaken Soviet second echelon positioning. Staff officers at Minsk headquarters mark the new German positions on the operations map. The line is already deep. The gap between where German armor is operating and where Soviet reserves are forming up is visible on the map. It is narrowing in the wrong direction. The road networks that German armor is using were built to handle commercial and military traffic in peacetime conditions. They are adequate for armored columns with wheeled vehicles for logistics. They are being used with practiced efficiency. German logistical preparations for Barbarossa included detailed survey of road networks and bridge load ratings along the expected axes of advance. Crossings that Soviet demolition teams might have destroyed are intact because the demolition orders either did not arrive in time or were overtaken by German assault teams. 10 hours. Pavlov's headquarters receives a message from the 10th Army, positioned in the most forward salient of the Western District's deployment, the Białystok salient. German armored forces have been reported on both flanks of the salient's base. The 10th Army, positioned forward to threaten German territory in the event of Soviet offensive operations, is now in a geographic pocket. The salient that was designed as an offensive springboard is becoming a trap. The 10th Army commander reports that supply routes running east through the neck of the salient are already threatened. German armored elements are operating deep enough to reach the roads that connect the Białystok salient to the rear. This is the moment when the operational geometry becomes undeniable. The Western Special Military District's forward deployment was designed around a strategic concept. Soviet forces positioned in the Białystok and Brest salients were supposed to threaten the flanks of any German advance through the Baltic states or Ukraine. The salients were offensive assets in a strategic plan that assumed the Soviet Union would have time to mobilize, organize, and potentially strike first or counterattack early. Germany did not give that time. The salients that were supposed to be offensive strengths are now pockets with closing sides. 1100 hours. Reports from forward rifle divisions confirm that German infantry, following behind the armored spearheads, is expanding the penetration zones and beginning to consolidate terrain. German infantry divisions are not as fast as the panzer groups, but they are following closely enough to occupy ground that armor bypasses and to prevent Soviet units from reorganizing in the spaces between German thrusts. At midday on 22 June 1941, Pavlov receives the consolidated picture from his operations staff. Multiple Soviet divisions are encircled or cut off near the frontier. Air losses are catastrophic and ongoing. German armored formations are operating 50 to 80 kilometers east of the pre-war frontier line in the worst affected sectors. Soviet mechanized counterattacks are forming up under air attack with incomplete fuel loads. Communications with several forward corps headquarters have been severed or are intermittent. The invasion is not a probing action. It is a full operational breakthrough across the entire central sector. More precisely, it is not a single breakthrough. It is multiple simultaneous penetrations at operational depth, coordinated to converge. Army Group Center is not advancing in columns that can be struck from the flanks. It is advancing in a pattern designed to fold Soviet flanks inward and seal large formations into pockets. The defensive structure of the Western Special Military District, deployed forward and thin in depth, cannot absorb this pattern. There is no prepared defensive line in depth to fall back to. The fortifications of the old 1939 Soviet-German border, the Stalin Line, have been partially dismantled and are not fully manned. The new fortifications along the 1941 frontier are incomplete. Between the frontier and Minsk, the terrain offers limited natural defensive barriers. The realization is precise and narrow. The district's defensive geometry is already obsolete. The German timetable has advanced beyond the point where Soviet mobilization cycles can close the gap within 24 hours. The mechanisms that Soviet doctrine relied upon to absorb initial contact and allow organized response have been overrun or disrupted in the first operational period. There is no corrective action available at district level that changes this. The door has closed. June 23, 1941. Counterattack orders are in effect. The Soviet mechanized corps assigned to the Western District are ordered to strike German armored spearheads along the Grodno and Białystok axes. These are not small spoiling attacks. They are attempts to cut the lines of advance of panzer groups that are already deep. The 6th Mechanized Corps and elements of the 11th Mechanized Corps move toward the assigned attack axes. The 6th Mechanized Corps had been moving under Luftwaffe attack since the previous day and has already consumed significant fuel reserves in movement. On June 23, its vehicle strength is reduced by mechanical breakdowns and combat losses sustained during the approach. The Corps reaches its attack position with fewer tanks than it started with and less fuel than the attack requires. The counterattack begins. Soviet armor strikes German forward elements near Grodno. In isolated engagements, Soviet tank crews fight with effectiveness. Some German formations are delayed. Some ground is retaken locally, but the counterattacks are not synchronized with each other or with artillery and air support in a way that generates the massed effect needed to halt a panzer group. Artillery units that should support the mechanized corps counterattacks cannot communicate reliably with the tank formations. Radio sets are in short supply. Then the ones that exist operate on different frequencies than the artillery nets. Coordination requires liaison officers who are often not present at the right location at the right time, because the tactical situation is changing faster than liaison procedures can track. Soviet aircraft attempting to support the counterattacks are operating under German air dominance. Soviet bombers sent to strike German columns are engaged by Luftwaffe fighters before reaching their targets. Attack aircraft flying without fighter escort suffer losses on each sortie. By 23 June, Soviet air units in the Western District are flying with reduced sortie rates, and pilot exhaustion is accumulating in squadrons that have been in combat since before dawn on 22 June. The counterattacks consume fuel. They consume ammunition. They reduce the remaining vehicle strength of formations that are already below their authorized complement. And they do not stop the German advance. Guderian's Panzer Group 2 continues driving northeast. Hoth's Panzer Group 3 continues driving southeast. The two thrusts are aimed at Minsk. Between them, the forces in the Białystok salient are being encircled. June 24th. The situation at the 10th Army in the Białystok salient is deteriorating toward a point of no return. Supply convoys attempting to reach the salient from the east are finding German armored elements across the roads. The Army's ammunition and fuel reserves, positioned forward for the anticipated operations, are being consumed faster than they can be replaced. Attempts to establish new supply routes through secondary roads are meeting German patrols and air interdiction. The 10th Army commander is issuing orders to his divisions. Some of those orders do not reach the intended recipients because communications links have been severed. Some orders that arrive cannot be carried out because the units have already moved or been destroyed. The map at 10th Army headquarters is showing a picture that is becoming increasingly disconnected from the actual positions of Soviet formations on the ground. The German operational maps are more accurate than the Soviet ones. German reconnaissance aircraft are flying over Soviet formations constantly. Their reports flow back to corps and army headquarters with sufficient speed to update German operational planning in near real time. German panzer commanders know where Soviet formations are. Soviet division commanders often do not know where the nearest German armor is until it appears in front of them. June 25th. German armored spearheads from both panzer groups are driving toward Minsk on converging axes. The city is not yet encircled, but the operational shape of the encirclement is already visible to anyone looking at the map. Pavlov's headquarters issues orders for new defensive lines east of Białystok. The divisions assigned to hold these lines are in some cases already under attack from German formations that have moved faster than the staff planning estimated. The defensive line on the map does not match the situation on the ground, because the situation on the ground is changing faster than the map is being updated. In the forests between Białystok and Grodno, Soviet formations that had been part of the first operational echelon are now moving without coherent contact with their higher headquarters. Radio sets have failed or been destroyed. Courier officers sent to deliver orders are intercepted or cannot find the formations they are seeking. Entire regiments are making tactical decisions in isolation based on the last orders they received, which may be 12 or 18 hours old. These formations are not surrendering. They are fighting, but they are fighting as disconnected fragments rather than as a coordinated force. June 26th. German armor reaches the area east of Białystok and west of Minsk simultaneously on both converging axes. The pockets are forming. Soviet columns attempting to move east along the main roads find German armor blocking the routes. Columns attempting to move through forests find the terrain channeling them into choke points. German aircraft are watching the movement. On the roads between Białystok and Minsk, Soviet transport columns, artillery units, rear area service formations, and infantry units are converging on road networks that cannot handle the volume. Bottlenecks form. German aircraft attack the bottlenecks. Vehicles are disabled and block the road. Other vehicles attempt to bypass and become stuck in the roadside terrain. The column stops moving. More aircraft arrive. This is the collapse texture. Not a single explosion. Not one decisive engagement. A progressive accumulation of blockages, losses, and disconnections that reduces a formation's ability to act as a coherent military force until it no longer can. At Pavlov's headquarters, the operations staff is tracking a map that is increasingly dominated by question marks. Units that reported their positions 6 hours ago have not reported since. Units that received orders have not confirmed execution. Areas that should contain Soviet defensive formations are being reported by other units as occupied by German forces. The command post is still functioning. Orders are still being drafted. But the formation below the command post is fragmenting at a rate that outpaces the orders. June 27th. The 6th Mechanized Corps, which had attacked with vigor on 23rd and 24th June, is now reporting vehicle strength far below its starting complement. Fuel is critically low. Many vehicles have been abandoned by their crews after mechanical breakdown or after being struck by air attack or German anti-tank fire. The corps that was supposed to be a powerful striking arm for the counterattack has been consumed. The 11th Mechanized Corps is in similar condition. The Mechanized Corps of the Western Special Military District were committed to counterattacks that absorbed their combat power without achieving the operational effect required to stabilize the front. This is not a failure of courage or initiative by the Corps commanders. It is the result of committing mechanized forces to offensive action under conditions where air dominance, communications breakdown, incomplete logistics, and speed of German penetration made coordinated combined arms operations impossible. General Katskilevich of the 6th Mechanized Corps will be killed in the encirclement that follows. June 28th. German armored formations seal the encirclement east of Minsk. The pockets that have been forming since June 26th are now closed. Soviet formations in the Białystok salient and in the area west of Minsk are cut off from the east. The road to Minsk from the west is in German hands. The city falls on 28th June. Inside the pocket, Soviet formations continue fighting. They are not collapsing instantaneously. Individual units mount organized resistance. Officers collect survivors from broken formations and attempt to create ad hoc defensive perimeters. Artillery crews fire until ammunition is exhausted, then destroy their guns. Tank crews fight until fuel runs out or the vehicle is hit. But the situation inside the pocket is deteriorating in every material dimension. Ammunition is finite. Food and water are finite. The wounded cannot be evacuated. Communications within the pocket are fragmenting further. There is no relief force coming from the east that can break through the German encirclement ring. The German forces holding the ring are not a thin screen. They are infantry divisions with artillery support consolidating terrain, while armored formations continue driving deeper into Soviet territory. The pocket is a closed system consuming itself. Breakout attempts begin. Soviet formations attack the encirclement ring at multiple points. Some groups break through in small numbers. Most do not. Organized breakout attempts at divisional scale require coordination that is no longer possible without communications. Individual officers lead groups of hundreds or thousands through forests, attempting to reach Soviet lines. Some succeed. Most are killed or captured. Late June, approaching early July. The accounting of losses at Soviet Western Front headquarters, which the Western Special Military District has now been redesignated, is producing numbers that are difficult to process. Divisions that had 10,000 to 14,000 men at the start of the campaign are reporting hundreds. Corps are reporting remnants. Armies are reporting that their organic formations can no longer be located or are encircled. The equipment losses across the district are on a scale that exceeds the planning parameters for any single campaign. Thousands of tanks, hundreds of aircraft, artillery batteries by the dozens, vehicles by the thousands. The material inventory of the Western Special Military District has been destroyed, captured or abandoned over the course of 9 days. The road to Smolensk is open. The Army Group Center's armored spearheads are already driving east. The next major objective, the Smolensk land bridge, the historical invasion corridor toward Moscow, is within operational range. There is no organized Soviet force capable of contesting that approach in the immediate term. At Minsk, 28th June to 30th June, the remnants of Pavlov's headquarters are operating under conditions of extreme pressure. The command post has relocated multiple times under air attack. Communications with higher command in Moscow are functioning. Communications with subordinate formations are largely severed. Pavlov is issuing orders to formations that may no longer exist as coherent units in the positions indicated on his map. He is commanding a front that has, in operational reality, ceased to function as an organized defensive force along its primary axis. Early July. The scale of the disaster becomes measurable from Moscow. The Białystok-Minsk encirclement, when Soviet and German records are later compiled and compared, produces casualty figures that establish this engagement as one of the largest military defeats in the history of land warfare. Approximately 300,000 to 400,000 Soviet soldiers are taken prisoner. Additional tens of thousands are killed in the fighting. The figure of dead and captured combined represents the near-total destruction of a front-level formation in less than 2 weeks. More than 2,000 Soviet tanks are destroyed or captured in the encirclement and the fighting that preceded it. Soviet aircraft losses across the Western military districts in the opening days of Barbarossa reach figures that, when they become known internally, constitute a strategic emergency for Soviet air power. The Western Front, as an organized military formation, has ceased to exist. The operational consequence is immediate and severe. Army Group Center is advancing on a schedule that matches or exceeds its own planning estimates. The road and rail network east of Minsk provides the logistical base for continued offensive operations towards Smolensk, 400 kilometers east of the pre-war frontier. At current rates of advance, Smolensk is within reach within weeks. From Smolensk, the road leads to Moscow. July 7, 1941. General of the Army Dmitry Pavlov is relieved of command of the Western Front. He is arrested by the NKVD. The charges brought against Pavlov include failure of command, cowardice, and unauthorized retreat. The investigation and prosecution are rapid. On 22 July 1941, exactly 1 month after the opening of Operation Barbarossa, Pavlov is executed. The execution of Pavlov, along with several of his senior staff officers and subordinate commanders, is a political act. Stalin and the Soviet leadership require an explanation for the scale of the catastrophe that does not implicate strategic decisions made in Moscow. Individual commanders failing in their duties provides that explanation. Pavlov is the most senior available name. The documented record of the opening days does not support the thesis that Pavlov's individual failures caused the disaster. It supports a different and more structurally accurate account. The Western Special Military District's forward deployment doctrine positioned Soviet forces in salients that extended westward into recently annexed Polish territory. This deployment was consistent with Soviet offensive planning assumptions and was approved at the highest levels of Soviet command. Pavlov did not design this deployment alone. He implemented policy established above him. The mobilization failure was not Pavlov's to solve in isolation. The directive to avoid provocative responses without Moscow authorization came from Stavka. It was Stalin's directive. Pavlov's hesitation in the first hours of the campaign was procedurally correct, given the standing orders he was operating under. The authorization delay was a systemic problem, not a failure of personal initiative. The airfield configuration that exposed hundreds of Soviet aircraft to destruction on the ground was a product of peacetime maintenance decisions and the absence of hardened infrastructure, combined with insufficient early warning radar coverage. These were not conditions Pavlov could have corrected in the days before 22 June. The mechanized corps reorganization that left Soviet armored formations at reduced readiness was a Red Army-wide condition reflecting the disruptions of the 1939 to 1941 expansion and restructuring. Pavlov's corps commanders were operating with what the organizational system had provided them. The communications fragility that collapsed as soon as German forces severed telephone lines and disrupted radio nets was a known vulnerability that Soviet military planners had identified but had not corrected before the campaign began. Wire-dependent communications in forward tactical positions is a structural problem, not a command failure at district level. What Pavlov did bear responsibility for, within the bounds of documented command decisions, is the operational sequencing of the mechanized counterattacks. Committing the mechanized corps to offensive action beginning on 23 June, under the conditions then prevailing, consumed the armored reserve of the district in engagements that could not succeed. Though an argument can be made that a more cautious withdrawal to defend key terrain might have preserved more combat power for the battles that followed. But that argument requires assuming that Pavlov had the operational picture clarity necessary to make a withdrawal decision when Soviet doctrine, Stalin's explicit instructions to hold ground and counterattack, and the fog of a communications breakdown made that clarity impossible to achieve in real time. The execution of Pavlov served the political need of the moment. It did not alter the structural verdict of the opening campaign. The structural verdict is this: Operation Barbarossa was designed to exploit a specific vulnerability window. That window existed because the Soviet Union had not completed the transition from peacetime to war footing. Soviet mobilization is reorganization of mechanized forces, completion of frontier fortifications, development of communications infrastructure, and establishment of air defense radar coverage were all ongoing processes that would have closed the vulnerability window over time. Germany struck before the window closed. The synchronized assault launched before Soviet defensive systems could complete their transition caught those systems in their most vulnerable state. Forward deployment in salients that had been designed for offense became a liability under a coordinated deep penetration attack. Aircraft parked for maintenance became targets instead of defenders. Mechanized corps being reorganized became partially capable formations instead of full-strength striking arms. The communications dependent on telephone lines became deaf and mute as soon as German forces and their air arm cut those lines. The fatal realization of 22nd June 1941, the recognition that the invasion's operational design had already outrun the Soviet response cycle, was not available at 3:15 when the first reports arrived. It became clear over the course of the morning as each successive report narrowed the range of possible explanations for what was happening. By midday, the picture was complete. By midday, it was also irreversible. The Białystok-Minsk encirclement, sealed in late June 1941, is the direct operational consequence of the timing failure in the opening hours. Not of any individual's error, but of a system that was not ready when the test arrived. The Soviet Union would survive. The Red Army would be rebuilt. The industrial evacuation eastward, already accelerating in the first days of July, would preserve the production base needed for that rebuilding. Mobilization would expand the manpower available. The structural overhaul of Soviet command, communications, and doctrine that the catastrophe made unavoidable would eventually produce an army capable of stopping and then reversing German advances. But that recovery would take years and cost millions of lives in the interval. The road that led to the survival of the Soviet Union ran through the ruins of the Western Special Military District, past the mass graves of the Białystok pocket, and east across a front that spent the summer of 1941 bleeding. Pavlov saw the pattern on the operations map before it was fully confirmed. He saw it in the simultaneous reports, in the scale of the bombardment, so in the aircraft losses in the opening hours, in the armor across the bug. He reported it up the chain of command. He requested authorization to respond to it. The authorization arrived after the operational moment that would have made the response meaningful had already passed. He died on 22nd July 1941 for a defeat that the system around him had made possible before dawn on 22nd June. The Western Special Military District ceased to exist as an organized command. Army Group Center continued east. The Eastern Front would be defined for the months that followed by the scale of recovery required to survive what those first hours had set in motion.